And I get the honor of presenting Bryan Swift. Whoop. I thought it was always loud enough. And he's going to speak on the history of Settles Hill. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to move this back up. Sorry, Carol. Not the first one. Please let me know if it's too quiet or too loud. Good right now?
Yeah.
Great. This is what I've been doing for the better part of the last 10 years, searching for history on Settles Hill. Thanks all of you for coming. I'm curious, how many of you maybe live now or lived on Settles Hill? Oh, great. I had 2 ringers come just in case, but we got more. On the other hand, many of you really know nothing about Settles Hill. Maybe don't even know where it is. Great. Yeah, so we got the range, and I'm hoping there'll be something I can offer to all of you, and if nothing else, maybe inspire you to take a ride through Settles Hill and see it in new light. A few disclaimers. I'm not a professional historian. I'm just dabbling in this stuff like any of you would do if you were curious about your surroundings. What I'm reporting tonight is, again, better part of 10 years, and there's still more work to do. It's like this endless jigsaw puzzle that I'm cursed with to keep working on. And I will say there's possibly and very likely some errors, because when you look through these old records, there's always discrepancies. Somebody will say, so-and-so was born in 1830, and the other one will say 1839. And so if you can correct me at any point afterwards, that would be great. All right, let's start with the big picture. If you don't know where Settles Hill is, it's in Albany County for the most part, in the upper corner of Guilderland. But it actually does, you'll see in a minute, it extends into Schenectady County and town Duanesburg to a degree as well. Here's a ground level view. If you're ever heading Route 20 from the Albany side toward Duanesburg, as you approach the Dunsville traffic light in this intersection, that hilltop on the left is basically Settles Hill. So if you're driving into Albany, it's not as obvious as when you're heading back out the other direction. Okay, here's where I want to give you a little more in-depth orientation. When I think of Settles Hill or talk about Settles Hill, this is Route 20. It sort of bounds the northern side. This is Schoharie Turnpike. This is the Bozakill Stream corridor. This is Lanehart Road, which you may not be familiar with. This is Route 397, where the Orchard Creek Golf Course and Altamont Orchards live. So that's the big picture. Where I've been focusing my efforts are on these roadways that sort of penetrate the interior. This is Settles Hill Road. Actually almost connects to Route 20 twice. This is Westfall, which is a very steep road down toward Altamont, village of Altamont. This is Furbeck Road, which you may be familiar with, out to Schoharie Turnpike. And then there's 2 dead-end roads, Gray Road and Bond Road. And I live at near the very end of Bond Road, so that's my point of reference, and really where I started this research. And then it just kept growing out there, and next thing you know, I'm looking at all of Settles Hill. Why am I talking about Settles Hill? Well, my wife and I have been living there for 40 years, and we love where we live. We've been curious. We do a lot of hiking in the woods, and you see stone walls, you find old stone abutments, metal fragments or tools and dishes, and you start wondering, who was here? Why were they here? And when were they here? So that was when I retired 10 years ago. That's when I started making some time to try and answer those questions. Charlie, good to see you. And Angela. And just because I like history, it's just fun. Some people like to do New York Times puzzles, which I do some, but this is an endless big one. And there's no answer sheet on the back either. So. One thing you'll probably sense is, I'm not sure if there's anything really unique about Settles Hill. It's probably very similar to the history and landscape that you all live in out this way. But it's probably typical of some of the semi-rural communities that we live in and around. All right. The view on the left is from a small airplane, and it's looking across the top of Settles Hill. This is Bond Road. So if you remember that dead end road, my house is actually right about there. So we're looking toward Albany. You can see it's mostly forested. A fair number of new homes were built starting in the 1960s and 70s, and since then it's pretty well built out now. A lot of these lots are 5 to 25 acres, interspersed with some small remaining bits of agriculture, but just for the most part a few hay fields scattered around. And this is just driving on Settles Hill Road itself. Again, you can see it's mostly forest, and it's not obvious what the history is there. Since we're here to talk about history, I'm going to go back in time now. This is a view of Settles Hill, aerial photography, 1952. I'm going to keep pointing Bond Road. That view from the airplane was all forested almost, and now you can see 1952 almost entirely in agriculture. Just a few small woodlots scattered around, hedgerows along the stone walls that are all throughout the property, or all throughout the landscape. Let's go back a little further. This is a map, a piece of a map of Albany County from 1854. And Settles Hill, maybe you'll learn to recognize the imprint of those roads, but this is Settles Hill Road again. Lane High Road would be somewhere in here. This is the Westfall Road, and then Furbeck goes out this way. You can see there's maybe only 30 or 40, and this is I know you can't read all these names, but these are names of residences, almost like a survey, a map from the census or something like that. And you can see it's about 30 or 40 farm residents. These would have all been farms on the landscape. It was probably not very different looking than in even 1952. All cleared, stone walls, some hedgerows. The names on the map there are some that carry through, and we'll talk about some of those folks in a little bit. Let's go back another step. Here's a map from 1767. Settles Hill is this little piece here. This is the Bosanquille Creek, and this area here is what became Altamont today. Helleberg was an early name for it, and Nowheresville. This is the Albany County line. I should have pointed that out a little more before, but anyway, 1767, it looks like it's pretty much unoccupied. So somewhere in that time frame is when the early settlement occurred, or began. But to be fair, there were people here before the European settlers came. Probably Mohicans, perhaps Mohawks. I think we're somewhere in that transition or overlapping zone. This is a marker near Dunsville. I forgot to mention on one of those earlier maps. Dunsville is kind of in that corner of Route 20 and Route 397. And this is a historic marker that says there was an Indian village along this small stream just off of Settles Hill. However, at this point, I'm not aware of any actual artifacts of Indian settlement or occupation. No arrowheads, encampments, stone tools, anything like that. So if anybody is aware of such a thing, I'd love to hear about that. But undoubtedly, Native Americans scoured, explored, hunted throughout this territory, even if they didn't entirely occupy it. Okay, the history of any part of Albany or Rensselaer County has to have some reference to this man, Stephen Van Rensselaer III. He inherited the vast land area that eventually became Albany and Rensselaer counties, with some exceptions for the city of Albany and elsewhere. This land area was granted by the Dutch king to one of his ancestors in the 1600s. So generations later, he was the owner, manager, keeper of a very vast land area, including Albany County, including Settles Hill. Under this Dutch, what they call the patroon system, wealthy landowners such as him would lease parcels of land to settlers who are then obligated to establish a farm and actually share the fruits of their labors, quite literally. The leases that were written between the farmers and the owner include things like every first of the year you have to bring so many bushels of wheat and 4 fat fowl, and a day of work with your wagon and horses, or maybe cut firewood. It was just an indentured servant arrangement, or tenant farmers, really, rather than landowners. But I use the term sometimes interchangeably here: deeds, leases, and so forth. You're probably familiar with the idea of the rent riots, which occurred in the 1840s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. That was when there was basically an uprising of the tenant farmers against this rule, and eventually it was discontinued. Long story, topic for another evening that I couldn't give, but somebody could. I wish I could. Anyway, even though he was the owner of this land, there were people settling and farming. It wasn't really, these leases weren't established formally until after the Revolution. And I suspect at that point he wondered whether he would need to, since there's no longer British involvement, he had to go out and he decided to survey all the farms out there, map them out, and establish a written lease that obligated people to make these commitments. And so the surveys were done in the 1780s, but then in the 1790s, early 1800s, that's when these lease agreements were established. So if you look in the deed history, a lot of them will say 1790. And in fact, some of those farms may have existed 20 years before that. They just weren't documented and formally in a lease. All right. If you can all read this clearly, I won't read it again. This is a map that I got a copy of from the Schenectady County Historical Society. I'm sure it means nothing to you, but if I tell you that this is the Albany County line around here, or what they call the Manor line, this is the Bozenkill Creek, this is Settles Hill, basically. And you think, well, that's great, but where are the roads? And there are names on there. But it turned out this was a huge breakthrough for me to try and make sense of the land on Settles Hill. And I'll show you why. Voila. When I looked at modern day tax maps, quite often they fit very neatly into those original lease boundaries, simply because they were passed down through generations and then subdivided. They didn't ignore the old lines. So I was able to sort of recreate that map into this mosaic, and of course if I had finished the task, these would all be filled in as well, but each one of these colored blocks is a farm, and they were under one leaseholder's name. Most of these were established, the lease was written in 1790 to 1805, I think is the range. But you can see they're roughly 70 to 200 acres typically, and the entire hill was covered. There wasn't really any big blocks of land that weren't considered farmed and leased. And I suspect that around 1800, again, the land looked a lot like it did in 1952, just extensively farmed, not a lot of forest land except woodlots for firewood and building material. Okay, I don't have time tonight to go into the detail of all 40 of these lots. I'm sure you're disappointed to hear that. But I will flip the script here in a minute. Ask the most common question about Settles Hill. Anybody know why it's called Settles Hill? Not a guess. Well, that's fine. Now you'll know. Two of these leases were held by brothers, Johannes Siddle, and Hendrik Siddle, Henry and John Siddle. If you imagine this is Settles Hill, in the old days you would have said, oh, I'm going up to Siddle's Hill. And it was spelled a million different ways, you wouldn't believe it. But that's the conclusion I've come to, is that's where it gets its name, is these two leaseholders right at the beginning as you get down top of the hill. And we just recently got a historic marker established by Charlie Stewart's house, sort of commemorating or documenting those findings. So I want to talk just briefly about the families that I mentioned. These two brothers came to the area probably in the mid-1700s. There's an Altamont Enterprise story from the 1930s that put these dates and these names among others who were early settlers of that part of town. So I'm kind of relying on that as my source. Even though you remember that 1767 map said nobody lived there at that time. Well, this is one of those we'll just call it the 1760s. This is probably when Settles Hill was first settled. These two brothers, they were German immigrants. I'm wondering what led them to this location, but Schoharie County had a big Palatine German presence by this time, before this. Whether they were on their way to Schoharie and decided, hey, we're either out of time or this looks good enough, let's go there. But as it turns out, by 1810, the two brothers, I believe, were deceased, but the entire family name kind of vanishes and seems to reappear down Schoharie County. So it makes me wonder, did they just want to rejoin German Palatine compatriots, or did they want to get out of that patroon system? Because I don't think Schoharie County at that time maybe had the same obligations. And unfortunately, there's really no homes or cemeteries that kind of further document the presence of these families. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about what life was like in these early days. And I just want you to keep a little mental memory of this photo here, and this house in particular. That's going to come into the show, in the program, in a few minutes. This is Bond Road, or what was Bond Road in the 1880s. I don't have an exact date on this photo, but sometime in the later part of the 1800s. So that's Bond Road, about a quarter mile from where I live. The road's not much better, but it's a little better. Some of the people that lived on Settles Hill, again, they were German, but also Dutch, a small amount of Irish families. If you look at the old census records, they were all big families. 6 to 10 children was not unusual. And multiple generations, you'd have grandparents and parents and grandchildren, all raising families and tending farms in the same neighborhoods. A lot of intermarriages. You see the same name. Not surprising. That's who you meet. That's who you get to know. So there's a lot of crossover between families. A few of the families were pretty wealthy, but it seems that probably most of them were just doing their best to get by and pay their lease and their rent and make it through another year. And I'll talk about some of those specific families in a bit. One of the things that I found curious, living in Settles Hill now, we think of Altamont as our village center. But back in the 1800s, going down Westfall Road, which is extremely steep, and then crossing a river that can be pretty treacherous at times, you probably went the other direction to do your business out on the Western Turnpike, which is where Dunsville is situated. So by 1850, for whatever reason, it seems like maybe Dunsville was fading out, or Altamont was, with the railroad coming through after that, made that more of an attractive center. As I mentioned, these are all farm owners. There's no commercial activity up on the hill. It's just making a living off the land. I think I said earlier, medium, pretty good sized farms, 60 to 200 acres. A variety of crops were produced, from oats, corn, rye, wheat, hay. And everybody had a few of each type of animal, whether for work animals or for food. I found this little piece of information just sort of illustrative of what farms were like back then. These 3 farms cover what is now Bond Road. And as it turns out, Jacob was at the far end of, or the end of Bond Road near Westfall. His son Jeremiah was at the next big farm. And then at the end of the road was Olshaver. Jeremiah's wife, his wife's name, she was an Olshaver. When they had a son, Thomas Van Auken, he bought the Olshaver farm. So again, just this, not quite inbreeding, but very closely connected family generations. And you can see the variety of crops and animals that each of those farms had. This is from New York State, I think, Farm Survey. All right. Well, we started with, say, 40 farms roughly on that early history. As of today, there's only about 14 homes dating from 1900 earlier. So a lot of those farms have been lost over time. And they're scattered. You can see they're not, each one probably represents a prior lease in the early days. Unfortunately, we're still losing houses from this inventory. Just in the last couple of years, these two houses, both on Bond Road, were torn down because they were just way beyond salvaging and making a livable home out of. Let's look on the bright side. We do still have some really beautiful homes to talk about. This one is on Furbeck Road. If you're familiar with, you know where the winery is. Just past the winery, on the left, is this house. It's across the street from what's now called Christmas Land. They have a holiday program right across the street. And this was an aerial photo from the 1950s I found of the farm. This is actually where Christmas Land is distributed now, and this is the house. You can see some of the same lines there, but it's been renovated, as many of these have been. I believe this is the oldest remaining house in Settles Hill. According to the town tax records, it was built in 1760. Again, it's not quite consistent with the first settlers and that 1767 map, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that it's somewhere in that general time frame. But it's pretty evident that it's probably the oldest structure or foundation. It's actually now an Airbnb to really bring it up to modern times. Unfortunately, I can't tell you much about the owner. It was, I've searched the family tree and all that, and I'm just not finding anything to tell you about Charles Shaver. All right, this is one of my favorite homes. It's on Bond Road to start with. Also because there's several old photos of the house. This is, as it looks today, basically. This is what it looked like in the 1800s. Evert Van Arnhem was a Revolutionary War soldier. He was the son of Captain Jacob Van Arnhem, who was a pretty high-ranking part of the Albany Militia, I think the 3rd Regiment, which there's a historic marker commemorating his service between Altamont and Voorheesville. If you're on that road toward Indian Ladder, you'll see his name. Evert and Helena had 11 children between 1787 and 1809, so they were busy trying to get manpower for the farm. But they also had 2 slaves in the household when the second U.S. Census was conducted in 1800. Not many folks, from what I've learned, just 2 homes, 2 families on Settles Hill had slaves. I don't know what their role was, if they were house servants, field workers, whatever. For whatever reason, Evert and Helena fell on hard times in the 1830s, and you start tracking the deeds, and it's going into foreclosure, and then lawyers, and then probate courts, and it's really a mess. But then finally, in the 1840s, Jeremiah Van Auken acquired the farm, and he lived there up until 1889. And the photo I told you to kind of remember, that Bond Road and the big farm, that was Jeremiah Van Auken's farm, what it looked like when he lived there. And he was very prosperous, pretty successful farmer. I had a couple of snapshots or photos of portraits in one of my earlier slides. Those were taken by a professional photographer, and I don't think the average farmer in Settles Hill had the money to pay a professional photographer, but Jeremiah Van Auken did. Okay, another house, one of the most beautiful homes remaining on the hill, I think, is right on Settles Hill Road, just south of the intersection with Furbeck and Gray Road and Settles Hill. So that 4-way stop sign if you go through there. This was owned, the property that it's on was owned by Isaac and Catherine Van Arnhem, another Revolutionary War soldier. He was a lieutenant. He was actually a brother of the Captain Jacob Van Arnhem that I mentioned earlier. According to the town records, this was built around 1829. I'm a little skeptical of that because he died in 1829 and he had a lease going back to 1790. So either the date is wrong or something happened to the house before or after he died, and maybe this was the next wave, the next reconstruction of a house that the subsequent owners built. I'm not quite sure. They also had 3 slaves in the 1800 census, and again, you can see that's a pretty nice house for a farmer. Oops, excuse me. And this house is now has been in the Rao family, who was a prominent name on the hill since 1975. Next we have a home that was built in the 1850s, perhaps 1855 is the date I think the town tax records show. The owners of this home are in our front row as dignified guests, Charlie and Angela Stewart. This is on further east on Settles Hill Road on the left-hand side as you are heading toward Dunsville. This is very close to where we have the new Settles Hill historic marker place. It's on Charlie's land, Charlie and Angela's land, and we appreciate that. After it was, the Vanderpools owned this land beginning sometime in the early 1800s, but this is actually on one of the original Siddle leases. So Hendrik Siddle, one of the first settlers here, this is on that property, but it's clearly not the home that they would have had in the 1700s. But it's a beautiful home. The Vanderpools are descended from another Revolutionary War soldier. You get the theme here that people who lived on Settles Hill in that time period, they were all involved in some way in the Revolutionary War. John Vanderpool Sr. was another soldier, and the Vanderpool family owned this land until about 1918. And that's when the Stewart family first acquired it and have been there over 100 years. The photo on the left is from 1913, and so these are the last of the Vanderpools who owned that home before it was acquired by the Stewarts. I have to mention Furbeck because it's a prominent name, one of the families that has been on the hill for over 150 years. Neither of these houses go back to that time period, but they were built at the time when there were Furbecks still occupying some of those leased lands many years later, 1900 for this one, 1888. Again, I'm relying on the town tax records for dates of construction or reconstruction. So there's no indication where the original farmhouse might have been for the Furbecks who were there in the early 1800s. One thing I find interesting is just the carpentry construction of some of these old homes. This is just up in the attic, and it's typical hand-hewn beams, mortise and tenon, joints with pegs holding it together. So those earliest homes were, just the way you would expect them to be. But what I didn't expect is when one of those homes was torn down on Bond Road a couple of years ago, when they started gutting it, removing the plaster, they found the wall filled with stones. This was the west wall, and I'm guessing this was the earliest form of HVAC. In the wintertime, those rocks would maybe hold the heat a little longer. In the summer, keep the house a little cooler. It was just on that one wall, but they were just packed in there neatly, and I've never seen anything like it. I asked some of the local historical house experts, and they hadn't seen it either. And of course, with houses, barns are even more prone to disappearance, unfortunately. So this was a barn at the end of Bond Road that looked pretty good 20 years ago, and then some winter storms, the roof starts falling apart, and I've not really made a conscious effort to look for old barns, but there can't be more than 4 or 5 left that are pretty aged. Of course, people aren't living in them, and if their purpose is done, then they let them go. Okay, Settles Hill actually had its own school in the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. It was right at the corner of Furbeck, Settles Hill, and Gray Roads. This is the house that's at that location now. And even though it's a fairly contemporary-looking house, if you drive slow and if you stop at a stop sign, you can actually see the stone foundation still underneath it. So it's kind of hidden gem there. But anyway, more interesting is the fact that here's a photo of what was there in 1860. Supposedly, according to this article, it was built in 1854. These are 11 students and a teacher. Again, this was, and probably all the families on Settles Hill sent their kids there for education. The way schools were organized back then, in 1812, Guilderland had 8 school houses covering the the whole town. This one being number 1, I think they just numbered them 1 to 8. But if I was on a sports team, I would say we're number 1. That's all that matters. And very tiny little lot that was kind of donated by the owner of that corner land. This schoolhouse that's been in these 2 pictures is built around 1854, but the records indicate there was something there, a little red schoolhouse mentioned in some deeds, even in the 1840s. And then around 1949, I think that's when New York State sort of centralized school systems and the schoolhouses were no longer used. I do wonder how many of those family marriages were a result of classmates and getting to know the boy next door, the girl next door, and all that. But Settles Hill had so much pride back then, they even had their own song for the school. This was in the Alpine Enterprise, 1889. This is just an excerpt from it, but I'll give you a minute. Just kind of a cute little poem song that was dedicated. And often in those good old times, beneath Miss Lendrum's rule, she must have been the teacher, we children at the Acker well drew water for the school. I didn't know what an Acker well was. I thought that must be some... Well, it turns out the landowner across the street, his name's Acker. Yeah, maybe you all knew that. I didn't. Those are happy, joyous days with fun and learning mix. So it's nice to know some things never change on Settles Hill. Of course, with life on Settles Hill, there's also the opposite. A number of cemeteries or burial grounds were commonplace, not just in this area, but throughout the country, throughout the state. Where before the 1850s, just family cemeteries were kind of a normal thing. At least 7 such burial grounds are documented by the Guilderland Town Historian in the 1940s. And this is a rough idea of where some of those are located. And again, a lot of these are in rough shape. They've been neglected for over a century. Most are in poor condition, overgrown, and nearly lost. And I've revisited most of these, but at least 2 I've not been able to find. They're either gone or just the location information is incorrect. This one is near Dunsville. You can almost see it from Route 20 when the leaves are off. That's probably the best condition of all of them. This is a more typical one on Settles Hill Road, the Vanderpool, near the Vanderpool house that I mentioned. Again, it's overgrown with trees. We've done a little bit of work on this one to try and clean it up and keep it recognizable. But in spite of their condition, there are some really nice headstones that can be found. As you look through, and there's some familiar names. These all 3 were 1820s, 1830s. Christopher Dunn in the Dunn Cemetery by Dunsville. This was Catherine, wife of Isaac Van Arnhem, who had one of those lovely homes, and that's actually the burial in the back pasture on that property. Here's another familiar name, Westfall. Peter Westfall was another soldier. Sophia Van Auken was his wife. She's buried, and so as it turns out, those 3 are really among the best I've seen for headstones. Among all those cemeteries, there are 13 Revolutionary War soldiers. As best we can tell, there was a road tour developed by the Taos Center chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in the 1940s. And this was really helpful to help try to find these cemeteries and contact landowners to see if we can make some sense of those. And one thing we're doing with that information, we're trying to document some of the Revolutionary War soldier burials on Settles Hill. The Guilderland Historical Society, this is John Halaska, Vice President of the Guilderland Society. He's really taken it to town. He's determined to get as many new markers up as possible. And this Pomeroy Foundation has been a fantastic funding organization. They've paid for 5 new markers on Settles Hill just in the last 2 or 3 years that have come out of some of this work I've done, but inspired by others as well. There's Charlie Stewart again, and another neighbor whose land, he was happy to have us put up a sign there. And this is another one on Westfall Road. It's Peter Westfall, another soldier. So if you're driving around Settles Hill, you see some of these new signs. And we're hoping to add a couple more. Just this past year, in fact, this past week or two, we've added two new signs at the bottom of Westfall Road. So technically it's not on Settles Hill, but we've kind of embraced them. The Van Auken brothers, two Revolutionary War soldiers, had a mill and were involved in running back and forth almost as messengers to the Schoharie Fort, Middle Fort, or Schoharie, I'm forgetting now which one it was. But anyway, they got recognition for their service. We thought the women never get any recognition. So we actually made a decision, made a commitment to try to do that. We've actually had a fundraising. Pomeroy Foundation felt we didn't have enough documentation because historical records are very male-based. And you got the father's name, no kids, no wife's name. So we were able to do this, but we funded it through the Historical Society with just donations. And so that's really something we're very proud of. That was the last edition.
Where is that, son?
Oh, I'm sorry. Both of these are together. If you're familiar with the Bozenkill Preserve, which is at the bottom of Westfall Road, where the Bozenkill Creek crosses, there's a parking lot for trails for hiking with the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy, and they've given us permission to put the two signs up right by the parking lot. So it's a nice, safe place to pull off and take a look at them, which is always a concern. Well, that's all, folks. This is a view, just as it turns out. This is from Fairview Cemetery outside of Altamont. A lot of Settles Hill older residents are now buried here with a great view of their beloved hilltop. So I thought that was a nice place to end. That's all.